Playing through Digimon Adventure was a humbling experience. The game itself is quite bare bones and brings little to the table, but there was a decent attempt made at mimicking the original anime series, and to its credit, I think they did a passable job. Designing a game to be reinforced by nostalgia can work. We've seen it with Bloodstained, Curse of the Moon, Shovel Knight, and even games like A Hat in Time, which successfully pulled it off by channeling the collectathon boom of the late 90s. The clear distinction being that the aforementioned titles adopted shit from older video games, where Digimon Adventure borrows from Digimon Adventure, the Chinese cartoon. Gameplay-wise, there's nothing to build upon, and the nostalgia's derived from a bastardized, mangled adaptation of the original work, then crammed into a medium which demands interactivity. Certain parts had to be stretched or downright flattened to gear it more towards being a game, and it suffers as a result. The gameplay has the fundamentals of a decent JRPG in place, however it's swamped by the Digimon brand tedium we've seen far too often. There's no tiptoeing around the fact that I've come out of the gate with a barrage of harsh words, but I actually think that despite all the flaws, it's a pretty solid experience. At least for a Digimon game. I started Digimon Adventure with a shallow memory of the original series since I haven't watched it in well over 15 years, so I was expecting to be entirely unaffected by the reliance on the familiar and to hate it like a regular game. What I wasn't expecting was the inclusion of scenes from the movie which I watched heavily as a kid. In these few moments, the nostalgia hit me like a truck, and I was experiencing the full intended effect, if only briefly. I do feel like the game was missing an important component though, like I didn't see Angelamon anywhere. Maybe I just missed her. After I beat the game, I decided to compare certain story sequences to the anime, and they're far from perfect, but they do keep an air of authenticity about them. The stage where Gabumon digivolves for the first time is a great example of how events were changed. In the third episode of the show, the main cast is camped out on a tied island, then Seadramon rocks up, unties the island, and takes him for a little spin around the ocean. Gabumon goes for a swim, becomes a big dog, saves a boy, and rips the serpent a new butthole. However, in the game, Seadramon shows up on the intact island and just gets his ass beat by the entire party. It's kinda underwhelming and downplays Gabumon's hero moment, but in these early scenarios, I'm glad the game didn't force one-on-one battles and make them obtuse and slow for authenticity's sake, because it happens quite a bit later on. The small strip of land connecting the island to the rest of the map has been widened, which was presumably to avoid collision issues, and it never detaches. This scene's also a great reflection on how narrative events were simplified and largely substituted for visual novel elements. I think this boils down to the system it was developed for, the PlayStation Portable, as plenty of fantastical action-heavy moments occurred in the original run of the show, and accurately reflecting that with 3D models on such an underpowered system would have been nightmarish. Also, if I had to guess, I'd say the budget to achieve such a feat was probably not there. The developers opted for simple movement and animation in cutscenes, which was largely propped up by dialogue and a modest roster of facial expressions. Occasionally, the 3D models are absent entirely, and we're fed a black screen with visual novel shit, which can be jarring. I'm not sure if I would have preferred an attempt at animating the busier sections of the show due to the stiff, rudimentary implementation of what little already exists. I think it would have just looked goofy and removed even more tension from these scenes than the black screen already does. The advantage to having tense moments occur off-screen is that it can prolong suspense. Having one of your senses dulled might instill fear or uncertainty, which left to manifest can impact you far more than a clear picture. In that regard, I think it can be used well, but here it largely comes off as lazy and overused, like it was a crutch to avoid any sort of complex animation. It's also borrowing from source material, which I think most people playing the game would have been exposed to in some capacity, so I'm pretty sure it's just a cop-out. When things are displayed on screen though, they look fantastic. The attempt to visually capture the anime is noticeable, and while the models aren't anything to write home about, the bright, poppy colours carry them quite a way. The terrain itself is fairly standard and even lazy at times, with snow textures being colour-swapped grass textures, but the 2D backgrounds use such an eye-catching soft palette, and they look brilliant. The music's also great. Every time a monster digivolves, I lose monetization. To ensure nostalgia was in full effect, the game features the key music from the show, such as the Japanese theme song Butterfly playing during the opening, as well as the Digivolution theme Braveheart playing during key story sections. I never actually watched the Japanese version of the show, but there's something about the song Braveheart which got me pumped up for basic JRPG combat. On their own, these songs are absolute bangers, and if Digimon Adventure achieved nothing else, it introduced me to these fantastic tunes, and genuinely, for that alone, I think it was worth it. Now, the combat I just mentioned has some quirks. It kind of functions like Grandia, where you can control the flow of combat with well-timed attacks, but it doesn't quite hit the same stride. There's a big difference between these two, but before I compare them, I want to briefly summarize how combat in Grandia functions so we're all on the same page. The system's turn-based, but with a catch, as your attack order is dictated by this little turn gauge, not unlike Digimon Adventure. When queuing an action, there's also a small chunk of the bar reserved for charge time, which differs depending on the technique. A close-range attack requires the character to physically move to the enemy in real time, during which the turn gauge continues flowing. And due to some occasionally iffy pathfinding, as well as a heavy variety of field positions for both yourself and the enemy, this window is an ever-changing variable. There are two types of basic attack. There's combo, which is a 2-hit combo and executes faster than the alternative, that being a critical. The critical does mildly decrease damage and is slower to execute, but it pushes enemies back on the turn timeline, and if they have an attack or an ability queued up, it'll be cancelled and their position on the timeline reset. The time spent charging attacks and moving towards enemies acted as a buffer in which a player who's either unfamiliar with their techniques or misjudges the timing is penalised by their attack not having the intended outcome. I gave a shallow description of the combat system because it shares the same fundamental idea as the one found in Digimon Adventure, where all participants act on a timeline and certain actions can retard their positioning and prevent turns. Where Digimon differs is that it lacks the real-time execution of attacks, as well as the charge time for techniques. Instead, it opts for a strictly turn-based system with fewer variables mixed in, yet it still features abilities which can slow enemy progress along the turn timeline. As Digimon lacks that attack buffer, it means that actions are carried out immediately after selecting them, and since certain moves can delay enemy turns, this had to be balanced somehow. Their solution was weaker attacks with a chance to inflict the ailments Shock or Break. Shock paralyzes the enemy's turn progression for a short period, while Break sends them back on the timeline, but as I said, they're entirely chance-based. Unlike Grandia's masterful risk-reward system, Digimon boils everything down to RNG, where these abilities might give you an extra turn, maybe. With no consistent reward for understanding the system and timing your attacks well, it feels like a cheap attempt to add depth where there really is none. This is made even worse by the fact that there are only a handful of difficult encounters throughout the entire game, which makes the need to utilize the system next to redundant. What's the point of gambling on a status ailment which may or may not trigger, and even if it does, may or may not grant you one extra action over your enemy when you could simply blast them with the strongest abilities and dispatch them quickly? Most battles consisted of me digivolving to my highest form and spamming the strongest techniques, and in 9 out of 10 fights I'd destroy the enemy before I exhausted my MP pool. Designing a system around inconsistency with minimal trade-off is ridiculous, and I'd wager the developers knew this given the low level of difficulty in combat. Or maybe that was just a coincidence, who could say? That's not to say there weren't challenging encounters, but between the mindless fights and the insane difficulty spikes at certain bosses, the well-balanced encounters are overshadowed. With that said, I still enjoyed this system far more than other games in the series, solely because encounters are no longer random. Little monsters run around the map, and connecting with them initiates combat, which means that tedium avoidance is a reward for precise movement. There's nothing you can do for those boss fights which throw you over a difficulty cliff, however, and party availability is often gated by story events, which can put you in near unwinnable situations that practically force you to grind. It also doesn't help that some Digimon are objectively stronger than others, and certain monsters will be locked out of their Mega Evolutions until the room before the final boss. While each character gets their fair share of the spotlight in the early game, the mid through late game boils down to a couple of Digimon who are simply better picks than others. This is where borrowing from the anime rears its ugly head. Because of the strict adherence to the story, the main quests are generally gated and heavily control who you can use and when. This would be fine if it was just the story quests, but there are two different types of side content, and these are also subject to the current party constraints. And I'd be more forgiving of this if story missions didn't force you to use certain Digimon just before a particular boss fight with no chance to change their equipment or level them up. While it only happens a handful of times, I spent way too long grinding the 1 or 2 monsters I had access to in order to compensate for the pathetically weak party I had no control over. Simply allowing there to be a place where you can always access any member of your party, which is completely separate from the story, would have offset this and made it a non-issue, but they had to make sure the game was accurate. Sometimes. I mean, it'd only help a little. As I said before, certain Digimon are legitimately unviable because of how the game prioritizes story authenticity at the cost of control over your party. During both story and side missions, speaking to your human friends will prompt dialogue ultimatums which increase your bond. Bond is a measurable stat responsible for an automatic follow-up attack, which is chance-based and doesn't cost a turn or MP. I'm really fond of this idea, even though if you fuck up a dialogue choice, you're permanently locked out of those bond points, and the translation I played was iffy, to say the least, but it's a neat reward for interacting with the visual novel elements in that it has some impact on gameplay. Unfortunately, it's also responsible for unlocking Mega Evolutions for the leftovers. Tai and Yamato are given their megas as a part of the story, but everyone else gets fucked unless you talk to them in the exact right ways, and only after you've pretty much beaten the game. I only unlocked 3 of the remaining 6, but it didn't even matter because they come right before the final boss anyway. Given that both Gomamon and Tentomon have some of my favourite Digivolution trees, the fact that I couldn't access them fully until I was basically at the credits left a very bad taste in my mouth. This is where the story should have taken a back seat, so the game could have made every Digimon a viable pick and unlocked their final form significantly earlier. I love diverse party rosters in JRPGs, so to be restricted by virtue of Megas being objectively stronger than Ultimates made me a very unhappy boy. Even the equipment system can't bridge the power divide, but it does try its hardest, existing as a creative way to gain power outside of flat leveling. Each Digimon has their own unique grid, which chips can be placed into to boost stats and grant special abilities. Chips all have their own size, and the more powerful they are, the larger they become, thus making them more difficult to place synergistically with other chips. It can be disappointing trying to manipulate your loadouts only to find that you physically can't slot everything in, but constraints breed creativity. Every time you gain a useful chip, you're confronted with a mini puzzle of trying to get the most out of what little space you're given. It's a really cool system. The grids do expand as you level up, but I got close to the level cap and still felt that there wasn't enough space. This isn't really a complaint, as I'm far happier to be given hard limits, and thus a challenge when speccing out my digital boys, but nothing sucks harder than when you're a couple spaces short of an amazing combination. While the game's fairly linear and doesn't grant enough opportunities to acquire chips as a result of the story or exploration of maps, it makes up for it with a crafting system. A modest selection of chips can be crafted with drops from enemies, and unused chips can be dismantled for ingredients. This allows the game some room to breathe when it comes to team customization, as it's not solely a linear affair which will always play out the same way. Were chips only available via side quests and story events, it'd be pretty uninteresting and restrictive, even though the game is quite lengthy. Giving the player that small element of control allows you to customize your team to a far greater extent, and even incentivizes grinding for parts. The cherry on top is that the menus are quick and snappy. They're how video game menus should be, and not like Digimon World DS or Dusk and Dawn, which have some of the most bloated, clunky interfaces I've ever seen. I mentioned before that there were multiple avenues you can lurk down when selecting a mission, so I'll briefly get into that before I end the video. The primary one is story, which follows the story events. Like, no shit. The second one is optional, which takes place on a map you've already visited, but generally accompanies a fetch quest, some extra bondage opportunities, and equipment as a reward. You know, the usual shit. The story missions can be quite varied in design. Most are moving from point A to point B with a boss fight at the end, but some include obstacles which are almost puzzles, and there's even one stage with a stealth section. Much like my sex life, it functions horribly, but it only lasts for about 30 seconds. If nothing else, it exists as evidence of an attempted spicing up, which is always appreciated. The third type of undertaking is effectively a dungeon for grinding, which only has one stage layout copied and pasted multiple times to give the illusion of progress. Every couple floors you get a boss, which is usually a texture-swapped Digimon from the story. Wow, what a reward! There is some endgame shit found solely in this dungeon, such as Davis and Vmon making an appearance, but it's not even worth it. Sure, you get Magnamon fighting alongside you, which seems rad, but he's entirely AI controlled and pathetically weak. The only Digimon you're given access to is Agumon, and you can't customize Vmon or level him up, so it's more of that party gating bullshit. It's not a reward for beating the game, it's a penalty for expecting something better. The camera also fucking sucks, as it's one of the few maps in the game which tries to lock to the back of the player, like it's a Nintendo 64 game. The camera in the actual game works significantly better, and it emphasizes how poorly designed these sections are. The standard camera is automatically controlled, but it's not awful. It seems like the core idea is to force the player to take in the surroundings with plenty of static angles and wide sweeping pans of the terrain. This can occasionally cause issues with the stray digital monsters looking for a fight and harkens back to the original Digimon world, which I fucking love, but it's mostly a pretty cool guy. Some maps had quite a bit of effort put in, and they look great. I guess that's why they reuse them so much, and why the camera trembles at the thought of you not appreciating them. Overall, the game had a low asset count, as even the standard enemies are heavily reused. There's little variety in what you'll stumble upon in a non-boss encounter, and when you get to the later stages of the game, it features the same monsters but with a star next to their name to indicate that they're more powerful. With a roster as large as Digimon's, pulling that shit's just fucking lazy. This might have been another anime thing where they only wanted monsters that appeared antagonistic from the show as regular encounters, but I'm way too lazy to check. To close, I'll say that despite my negativity, I still think it's one of the better Digimon games. While there's some big issues, most of the design offsets the pain that those decisions bring, where other titles in the past have accentuated it. It's charming, mindlessly enjoyable, and a fantastic trip down memory lane, even for a cynical cunt like me. I would have loved a sequel to this, taking place over the events of the second series and fine-tuning a couple of the things I criticised in this video, but that's probably not going to happen. There's so much potential in a title like this, which I say about a lot of Digital Manstar games, but it's never been more true than this one. Ah well, it is what it is. As always, thanks for watching. I hope to see you next time when I cover... shit. I think someone's hacked my memory.